Hi again. So just to recap where we're up to, we spent last lesson looking at comparing afternoons in London with the theme of people and places, and that took a long time. And today we're going to have a look at comparing for the theme of nature, which is going to take much less time. And then we're going to reflect on whether London's a sensible choice. If you were given afternoons for the theme of nature, would London be a sensible choice? And if you were given afternoons for the theme of people and places, would it be a sensible choice? Okay, so before we get stuck into comparing nature, let's just recall what we talked about for nature for afternoons. So firstly, we had a look at the physical elements of nature, the trees, the leaves, the wind, and Larkin presents these as very powerful, that they are in control of the humans, the mothers who are living this life. We then had a look at more abstract elements of nature, so for example time and seasons, and how these are unstoppable, and again they're controlling. And then we had a look at how humans interact with nature. So the response to the passing of time, the mothers, how their beauty's thickened, they feel like something is pushing them aside, the wind's ruining their courting places. Now, I do think already, if we think about our illuminating comparisons, where one poem changes the way we look at another, that third point is certainly, I think, you can see much more now that we've done the people and places, that yes, he focuses on humans how they interact with nature, but their actual emotional response is very much missing in Larkin's poems. Remember, we talked about that in terms of, Blake's speaker really empathizes with the people of London, the marks of weakness, the marks of woe. He sees their feelings, whereas in Larkin, he's very focused on that interaction with nature and how how nature influences humans, but he doesn't really consider an in-depth emotional response to it. Now, that outline there would be a really good solid 20-minute essay structure for your response to a single poem. If you got afternoons for nature, that would almost be a really nice essay outline for you. So it's worth kind of jotting that down. So let's now have a look at comparing with London. So firstly then, we're looking for physical elements of nature, and hopefully your initial thoughts are there aren't many, because there aren't. We pretty much just have one, and that is obviously the river. Now, whereas in afternoons, the trees and the wind and the leaves, they're in control, aren't they? They're shaping the environment, they're shaping these women's lives. Here, Blake does the opposite. The river is being shaped by the people who have chartered it, so the traders, the shipping companies. So it's actually nature's being restricted here, whereas in afternoons, nature is restricting the people. Now, it's easy to think why Blake might look at it this way. He's living during an industrial revolution. He's seeing all this natural land being, bulldozed down to be replaced by factories, new homes, as London was spreading massively during its urbanisation. So you can see why he might take this approach, that nature is being sort of controlled and crafted by people. And it obviously fits into his wider idea about, the damage people do to themselves and to the landscape. But in terms of building a strong comparative case, whereas you have got nice physical elements of nature threading throughout Larkin, there is really just this one here. There is just the river. If you have a look at the rest of the poem, and I've just highlighted some examples for you with the blue, there are so many other things in this poem that are manufactured. Again, reflecting the whole point of the Industrial Revolution and its whole purpose. That was what it was focused on, wasn't it? So, it's either a manufactured idea or a manufactured object. I haven't underlined blood. I did, arguably blood is a natural substance, so there is an evaluative point there, maybe, if you can get something good out of that. But essentially, because there are so few references to physical nature, that would be a little bit of a limited comparative point. Obviously, you can make the point about the absence of nature, but that is something you can only make once. Okay, so that's something to bear in mind when we're going to decide if we want to use nature for our if we want to use London, if we get nature as a theme. Right, the second element that Larkin presents is time and seasons. Again, there is almost an absence of time here because we feel like it's going to go on and on, which means we could perhaps argue that there is that cyclical element still. especially at the end, this idea of the harlot passing it on to the infant, the idea of death of love, and these, this idea that it's going to be cyclical and it's never going to get better. Poverty is going to go from one generation to the next. So there is an element of a seasons here in terms of things just going round and round and you can't stop it. However, this isn't a natural cycle. This isn't a natural season. This life doesn't have to be this way. Arguably, we come back to that later. It's a man-made, constructed, manufactured misery. So again, even though that's a very valid point in terms of, it is a comparison about this idea of cycles in both poems, it's not technically a nature or a natural element in this poem because it is so manufactured. And finally, how humans interact with nature. The absence of it is kind of more telling than the presence of it. The only interaction we have with this river is the chartedness of it, the idea that the river is there to be used for business. And again, it kind of links back to the first point, really, in that, our interaction is whereas in Larkin's poem, the nature is the one in control. Here, it's the other way around. So with this line of argument, you might end up repeating what you've already said for point 1. So on the surface, when you look at that, nature is not particularly, I'm hoping you can come to this conclusion as well, that nature is not particularly a rich theme to use for London, because essentially what it boils down to is an absence of nature, and that is, like I've said, only really 1 point. And you've got to write for 40 minutes, and you've got to have a sustained response that covers both poems. If you have a look there, look at how many quotations from London you could use. Very few. And especially because you'd need to show full understanding of the second poem, how could you do that through this theme? So you could conclude that it's not particularly rich. However, remember what we said about illuminating comparisons. So, and I'm teaching you through these steps because I want you to be able to do this independently for other poems when you're doing your comparisons. So what we did there, if you reflect on our process, we took our ideas about nature that we got from Larkin's poem and we applied them to Blake's poem. But that's not a very thorough way of doing it, because we have to do the same in reverse. What if there is an element of nature in Blake's poem that helps us to see something new about nature in Larkin's poem? So we have to ask ourselves that question. Is there an element of nature that Blake presents, and can we see that in Larkin's poem too? And even if we can't, is there a difference point we can get out of it? So make sure that you take that process when you're doing your comparisons independently. Don't just apply one set of ideas. The idea is that new poems should make you look at the themes in new ways and see different ways of approaching the themes, and then you'll get a really rich body of poems that you can compare to each other. Okay, so I think that London introduces this fourth new way to look at the theme of nature, and that is human nature. I think if you return to London and you're asking yourself, well, what else is about nature in this poem? You've really got at its core heart that mind-forged manacles. Sorry, it's got the Ian again, it keeps annoying me. It's not got the Ian forged in the official spelling in your anthologies. Just make sure you use your anthology spelling. Sorry, so if you look at London for nature, that core quotation about the mind-forged manacles, really suggests a lot about human nature. That we trap ourselves, that this whole poem, is obviously capturing this whole time period in this place of London, and it's all these things have been constructed by human beings, that it was in our nature to create a world that did all this. And you could argue that the elements of the world are still living, are still controlled by these forces, and we still feel like this. So I think that this human nature is a really interesting thing to explore, and I think there is scope to look at afternoons again in a fresh light. So Blake suggests that it is human nature to control their natural environment is one of the things that we've already picked up on from the previous slide, so through charted. Whereas afternoons in Larkin suggests human nature is submissive to physical nature. So the wind is very powerful, it's ruining the courting places, and women are being pushed aside, so women are powerless. So if we just put the argument from the last slide in the context of human nature, Blake's suggesting that humans naturally, it's in our natural instincts to control our environment. And Larkin suggests that it's the other way around, that people are powerless in the face of nature. Now, the reason this is a really strong comparison point is because it links so nicely to context, because you can absolutely understand why Blake would take this stance. As we said on the previous slide, it is so easy to see why in the Industrial Revolution he might feel like humans are just naturally, instinctively destroying their environment. You might still feel the same way in terms of climate change now. Certainly by Larkin's time period, I feel like human beings had plenty of opportunity to learn that nature will often win. You can't go through 2 world wars thinking that you're still mighty and powerful. The sinking of the Titanic in 1912 was very famously an example of man's arrogance, and that all that wealth and belief and faith in their own creation destroyed by an iceberg. So I think contextually you can understand again why Larkin might not have taken that approach, and certainly a poem written today. I mean, I don't know, that we are still destroying our climate, so maybe we are what Blake said. That's, you can ponder on that philosophically in your own time, and think about it further. But it lends itself actually really nicely to a strong comparative argument. Obviously then, the most important human nature element is the mind-forged manacles, which we'll move on to now. Oh, sorry, I did want to say, obviously you have not got the 2 poems next to each other in your anthology. I have sent you a copy so you could print them off and make yourself a comparative slide, but sorry, you can put them next to each other on your piece of paper and draw lines. However, you might find it easier to just make these notes as kind of like almost like a vague outline of an essay. You don't necessarily have to annotate these on your poems. So getting back to the mind-forged manacles. So we can definitely argue that both poets suggest that it is human nature to trap ourselves, and that I think is a really kind of core idea in both poems, and we did talk about that with People and Places in terms of the people are trapped. So we're just tweaking that argument and we're making it relevant to the theme of nature, which is a really important skill. If you can do that in your exam, if you can take what you already have in your head, that you've already planned, that you already know, and think, well, how can I tweak that so it's more relevant to the theme I've been given, then that will put you in good stead, that flexibility. Same as what you do with every other literature text, you're just tweaking what you've analysed so it fits the question. So they both suggest we trap ourselves. So Blake, as we said, most importantly, the mind-forged manacle, we're mentally trapped by our society and our environment. But of course, in the terms of urbanisation, human beings created the environment. They came up with the blueprint for it. Nature didn't decide that a city should look a certain way. Larkin does take a slightly different approach. So arguably, he doesn't suggest the women are mentally trapped because they know they're being pushed. Now, I've only got one quotation to support that, so it's perhaps a weak argument, but I do think you can justify that if they're aware something is pushing them to the side of their own lives, then they are aware of this. They're aware that the wind is ruining the cotton places. Oh, that's possibly a better quotation. Line 15, because the wind is ruining the cotton places before them, so therefore they can see it. It's obvious to them. So that kind of shows an awareness more, perhaps, than the last 2 lines. But together, definitely, that's a much stronger case. So add on line 15 for that one. So they're not mentally trapped, but they are trapped in the roles that society has set for them. So we're kind of looking at higher level points here, really, that, it is human nature to trap ourselves through society. So remember that society is just created by human beings. Like the rules that we have and the way we live and the things we value have all been crafted by humans. So therefore, if we feel trapped by our expectations of what society expects of us, then we are trapping ourselves. Okay, so our modern day example might be the restrictions you feel on Instagram about how you're supposed to look or how you're supposed to behave. Well, who set those rules? Human beings did, and yet they're making us feel unhappy or trapped or not good enough, etc. So you've got various quotations for this because it's essentially his core message in the poem, isn't it? So the trees bordering, we box ourselves in our physical environment. We limit ourselves where we can go in life or where we can physically move. You've got the young mothers assemble, as if they are just doing a duty. We've got the husbands standing in skilled trades doing their duty. So you've got this really strong case here for human nature that both poets are suggesting that is what human beings do. And because both poems suggest this idea, it becomes a stronger concept. So you've got two writers writing, a long time apart, about 150 years? Oh, don't hate me for my maths. And they're both saying a similar thing about human beings, and it becomes a really strong idea because these two poems together are saying this same idea, and it might make you think moving forward in your own lives about how you can overpower that and how you can change that, if you even would want to. If it's in our nature, then maybe that's what we'll always naturally default to. Okay, so you can also evaluate this and consider, so for Larkin, you might want to weigh up, are the women more trapped by time and nature, so like physical elements, or are they more trapped by human nature, like society or themselves? So you've got a nice evaluation, you could go down there. Now remember, these points you could also add on to your analysis of afternoons if you got the theme of nature as well for your single poem response. Okay, so let's just reflect then on the two themes and kind of where you could move forward with this. So, focusing on nature first. So we obviously said about the paraphysical elements of nature for Larkin, and we could compare that to the lack of nature in London. We said about the abstract elements of nature. We could link that to the idea of a man-made cycle. That is a bit of a weak argument. We could talk about humans interacting with nature, but then that is absent from London really, so that's a difficult one. And then we've got the two arguments that we just spoke about, which are strong arguments for nature for both poems. So given that, so if you just take just pause if you need to take those in further, you've got essentially 5 lines of argument there, 2 really strong ones, and then 3 less so. So weigh it up now. You've got 40 minutes. Are those 5 lines of argument strong enough for you to write about this theme for these 2 poems for 40 minutes? Is there enough about nature in both poems to justify it? Could you show a secure understanding of London through this theme? And just a reminder that you can only make the point about an absence of nature once. So I think the key thing to take away from this is it is up to you, and I don't want to stand here and say do this poem for this theme and this poem for this theme. I'll guide you, but I do want it to be your choice, and you might be able to see things about nature in these poems that I haven't spotted on this Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock. You just don't know. So if you can find more things, or if you think you can write a really strong essay with those 5 lines of argument, then absolutely give it a go. See how you feel about it. Don't worry, I'm not actually asking you to write the essay. Not yet anyway. So that's just, I'm trying to sort of teach you the process you need to go through mentally to decide which themes you would like to use. That was my last slide. People and places, absolutely. It's a really strong case. You'd get a really good essay out of people and places for London. That's why it took me an hour to do the video for it. So there's a lot there for people and places. Nature, like I say, it is up to you. I would stay away from it. And as we move forward through the rest of the week or weeks, we are going to look at 2 alternative poems. And I do think that when you see what else is out there for nature to compare to afternoons, that you might find yourself discrediting London even at this point. Now you might ask yourself, why did I bother to teach you nature through London if I didn't, if I was going to sort of suggest you don't bother to do that comparison and there are better options out there? I think it's important because it's important that you start from day one looking at these poems as not being chained to one specific theme. I did tell you about the exam boards last year where they chose A Wife in London and they applied it to the theme of loss, and it really did throw a lot of our students because we looked at it as a war poem, we looked at it as a love poem. So it's really important that you approach these poems through different lenses because you get more out of it. Look at how much more we've got out of London today. Thinking about what's missing, or that idea of the Industrial Revolution and that heavy manufacturing elements, we wouldn't have got that necessarily if we hadn't looked at nature. So it is important that we apply different themes and explore it through different lenses. So that's it for today, quite a short one, and I will see you next time when we will be looking at living space.